All right, we're recording.
Hi, Brad Carroll.
Ah,
Hello.
hey,
You can hear us?
I can.
Yes. Or if you're video, or if you're just on voice call, that'll work too.
No, I'm on video. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but we don't have video of you yet. We see your name.
Let's see.
Well, I mean, technically, you can see your face.
There he is.
Technology.
This is my advanced theater class, and thank you for being a guest on Interviewsday. We are happy to have you and to interview you and to learn about your illustrious career.
Oh dear.
So first, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us where are you today?
Hi, I'm Brad, and right now I'm in Cedar City. I'm working at the Shakespeare Festival conducting the production of Joseph that I directed earlier in the summer.
So was that always the original intent, that you would direct it and conduct it?
Well, I directed it, and Jeremy was here conducting until the end of August. He teaches at UCLA. He had to go back to teaching. So we knew enough in advance that I was able to just come in and be here for the fall run.
Well, that's great. I'm going to merge the screen a little bit. There we go. Okay. All right. So you've already addressed two of your skills. So obviously with music and with directing.
Uh-huh.
Now, did you start out as an actor and move into that, or was directing what you always wanted to do? And you also write as well. So tell us about that whole process.
Okay, I'll try to make it short. I started out in music. I mean, in going back to elementary school, music was what got me hooked into this whole racket to begin with. I was an instrumentalist, and I went through high school thinking I wanted to be a high school band director. So when I went away to college my first year, that was my intention. I had gotten hooked into theater my senior year of high school. I took a drama class to satisfy an English requirement because I didn't want to take literature. And suddenly there was this whole drama thing that became part of my life. And so I went to music school with the intention of becoming a music educator. And the sad part of that story is I had this really evil teacher that after a year of putting up with this man every Friday at 4 o'clock for my private lesson, I said to my parents, I can't go back and do that again. And for a 19-year-old kid, that's kind of a brave thing to say to your parents. And my parents, God love them, said, well, what do you want to do? And there was an acting conservatory near where we lived in California. And I said, I want to go there and study theater. So that's what I did. So I was there for 2 years, thinking now I wanted to be an actor because instrumental music was, I was a woodwind player, was not much of a draw in the theater, but I was also a piano player. And in the course of my time there, the voice teacher sort of put my musical skills and what I was learning about the theater together, and that got me on a path to being a musical director. So when I got out of that school, my first professional job at age 20 was as a pianist and a musical director in a little theater nearby. And then what I learned is if you play the piano, people just assume that you write music. So in this theater, the producer said, well, could you write this for us? And me, I'm game for anything, always have been. I said, well, sure. So in the course of working for that theater for 2 years, I sort of became a composer, just out of necessity to keep that job. And I found out that I really liked that. And so then flash forward 10 years after being kind of out in the world for a while, the conservatory that I attended for those 2 years called me and said, we need a new music director. Do you want to be that person? So I came back to the school where I trained to become the resident music director. I was there for a year. And at this point, I'm 30 years old. I'm still a kid. I know to you guys, 30 years old is like dead, right? How did you live to be 30? The artistic director came to me and said, I think you need to direct. And I didn't even know what he meant because I had no designs on directing. And so I went and talked to him. He goes, I want you to direct the big holiday show, which was Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella. And as a great mentor, he said, I'm not going to hover. I'm not going to breathe down your neck. I'm going to let you do this. And if you need help, call me. So I go into staging this gigantic production of Cinderella, and it was a success. And so then he gave me another show in the next season. And within about 3 years, I was actually directing more than I was music directing, but I was learning because I was in the trenches having to produce theater in a major regional theater. So then directing became my passion because there's just something about it that was different than acting, that was different than music directing that I just loved. It just all has to do with having a bigger vision of what you're trying to say. And then, so I became a director. I went to that theater. I thought I would be there for 2 years. I was there for 15 years. And then I left there to try freelancing to see what I could do. And the world opened up and opportunities came along. And I mean, what I can tell you, I mean, that sounds like, wow, that's totally successful. How did you do that? Well, I showed up on time. I was always prepared. I always did really good work, and I always worked to the fullest capacity I could understand to work at. And because of that work ethic that I got somewhere, the rest of my career came to me. So in 43 years, I've done 3 job interviews. And I've worked in the theater for 43 solid years. So, and I don't think I'm the greatest thing ever.
I do.
Well, thank you. But I do know how to get the job done and get it done well most of the time. You know, so it's, people talk about talent and skill and all of that kind of stuff, and that's all really good. But like being a good person and being somebody people want to be in the room with, every job I got after that came from either somebody seeing the work I had done or somebody working with me and recommending me to somebody else. You know, and I mean, just another extension of that story, I ended up working for Disney as an Imagineer for 3.5 years. And I got hired because one of my students at the conservatory, and I didn't know this the whole time he was there, his father was a big muck at Disney, was in charge of new show development, had seen everything his son had done for 2 years while I was his teacher. And I directed like 4 different things. I wrote something that he was in. I was in things with him. So when I was getting ready to leave that job, Steve came to me and said, what are you going to do? I said, Steve, I honestly don't know. I said, I just know I know how to do this. And I want to see if I can do anything bigger, different, better. And if I can't, I know I can come back here. And he pulls out his card and hands me his card. And there's Mickey Mouse on his card. And he said, well, why don't you come see me? I've got a project that I think you might be really interested in. And boom, I'm working for Disney without ever having interviewed. I had never even submitted to them. But somebody at Disney saw my work, liked my work, and said, I got a project for you. I didn't plan for that. I would never have even thought of applying to work for Disney. So the crazy thing about a career is you just don't ever know where it's going to go. And if you're open to, sure, I'll try that, which was who I was. I'd try anything. Then opportunities present themselves, you know? And I know lots of people who went to school, they got a degree in this, and they went out into the world, and that's what they're doing. That's another way to do it. But there is no method for success, I don't think, or even working consistently, you know? And it also depends on what you consider to be success. That's the big ticket item.
So let's talk, you mentioned a little bit about your writing. We have a script and a CD of yours sitting in our other classroom.
Oh gosh.
Of Lend Me a Tenor.
Uh-huh.
So tell us a little bit about that process. How did you and your co-writer, how did you guys come about creating a whole new show?
Well, that's another just strange story that we couldn't have predicted. Peter and I had written A Christmas Carol on the Air, which you remember, for the Utah Shakespeare Festival. They wanted to try to do something at Christmas. So we wrote this show in a real hurry, too. We wrote it in about a month. And the Shakespeare Festival people liked it and said, well, why don't you guys think about writing a full-length musical, and when it's ready, we will produce it. Now, that is a dream come true for writers, because most writers spend 3 years writing something and then 6 years trying to find somebody to produce it. We had somebody online saying, you write it, we'll produce it. So we started looking for properties, mostly public domain things that we could get for free, you know, like old stories, old novels, you know, Dickens and Hawthorne and people like that. And then one day, just another coincidence, Peter said, I'm acquainted with Ken Ludwig, who wrote the play Lend Me a Tenor. Peter said, I'm gonna email him and see what he would think about turning his play into a musical. And I said to Peter in the parking lot at USF, I said, you're crazy. I said, I'm sure people have been beating his door down for 20 years to get the rights to that play, because it's a really funny play. And Peter sent Ken an email saying, what would you think about this being a musical? And Ken wrote back the next day and said, I never even thought about it, which I just about dropped in my track. I could not believe that that was his answer. He goes, I think it's a great idea. Let's talk about it. So all of a sudden, and then 5 months later, we had the rights. We'd done all the legal work. We paid the money to get the rights for it and had an agreement with him. And we set to work writing it, knowing that in 2.5 years, in order to keep the rights, we had to have it produced. So we spent 2.5 years writing it and developing it and workshopping it until finally the Shakespeare Festival put it into their season in 2007. And all Peter and I really wanted to do was write a good musical. That was our goal. We had no eyes on Broadway or any of that stuff, right? Because the title was so popular, for about 20 years, Lend Me a Tenor was the most produced play in the country. Every college and community theater and high school and across the nation were doing it. Ken, after he wrote that play, never had to work again. He made so much money on it. And we're thinking, excellent, maybe this will happen for us. And because of the title, we had 3 producers from New York fly to Cedar City to see the premiere of it because they were intrigued about what it would be as a musical. We didn't ask for that. We didn't anticipate that. We had no idea something like that would happen. And then all 3 of them wanted to pick it up and develop it further with, Broadway as the target. So we went into a little sort of bidding war with these producers to find out what they thought, how long they thought it would take, any sort of changes that, there's just lots of stuff you have to talk about when you're going to move to that next commercial level, because now you're not talking about thousands of dollars, you're talking about millions of dollars. You know, the average Broadway show today costs $18 million to get it open. That's a lot of dough, right? And then we ended up going with this particular producer who I was already acquainted with, but he gave us all the answers that we thought we wanted to hear. And then, so we're off and running, and then we ran into all sorts of complications with Ken. They did a revival of the play in New York, and you can't open a play with the same title in the same city in the same season. And we'd been through some real difficult times, a lawsuit that cost $300,000. And I was ready to give up. And then this producer, Martin, called me and I said, let's just start over. Let's just burn this script and start with something new. I'm done. And he said, give me 24 hours. I said, okay, at this point, 24 hours, 2 years, whatever. And he called me the next day and said, how would you feel about opening it in London? And I said, that sounds cool. I've never been to London. And within a week, we were mobilized to move the entire Lend Me a Tenor, the musical operation, to London. And a year and a half later, we opened in the West End. And yeah, I mean, again, didn't ask for that, didn't plan for that, had no capacity to make that happen except through the goodwill and interest of other people. And as I said, it goes back to all Peter and I wanted to do was write a good show. We weren't focused on all of the external stuff. And then now it's published, it's produced all over the world. And again, a level of success that I could not have planned.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So looking at what you've done, for you individually, what's more difficult? The directing, the writing, the composing, the performing? What's your main passion? What's the easiest route for you, and what's your biggest challenge?
Well, I mean, my main passion is writing. And it's sort of hard to explain why. I mean, I love directing. Directing always involves at least 50 other people, between casts and designers and producers and all of that. I love using that part of my brain as a director, having to manage all of that and aesthetically put something on stage that's going to make sense. And there's something about writing that starts out with just you and your writing partner or partners. So it starts out as a much smaller thing. And the thing that is so sort of uniquely special about especially composing is if I write a song, at the end of 3 hours or 3 weeks, however long it takes to write that song, I have created something that before did not exist. It's brand new to the world. Whether anybody likes it or does it, doesn't matter. I made something out of nothing that now exists in the world. When I direct a play, you know, if I'm doing like Joseph, I love Joseph. It's the 5th time I've done it in my life. But Joseph has been done. Joseph is not new anymore. Joseph was new in 1969, right? So there's that difference, you know, between creating something new, creating or recreating. And there's something about the creative impulse that is what really gets me excited.
So what other things have you written, or what other projects do you have in the works that we should be looking forward to?
Well, Peter and I are writing together again, so look out, world. We've spent the last 5 years talking about writing, but I live in California. He lives in Cedar City, Utah. It's hard to write when you're far apart. You know what I mean? There's nothing like looking somebody in the eyes when you're trying to collaborate that intimately. And it's like being married. You know, we call each other our office spouse. because that's what it feels like. It's a marriage. Because you've got to be able to yell at each other and then hug before you leave and make sure that nobody goes to bed mad and all of that kind of stuff. But we're working on a series of sort of goofy Sherlock Holmes musicals. And these are the brainchild of our friend, Peter Sham. And there's a big dinner theater, of all things, in New Jersey that Peter used to work at. It's where he met his wife 30 years ago. And he's become part of the producing entity of this theater, because the man who was running it when he was working there is still running it, and called him and said, you want to help me run this place? And Peter said, as long as I can do it from Utah. So he's got this business arrangement with this guy. So we're creating these musicals. Peter is hiring students from SUU to go to New Jersey to be in them. Rhett Gooder, who you know, Brad, is directing them.
Oh, wow.
So it's all of these worlds coming together in New Jersey, of all places, to put on these musicals that are really silly, but because Peter's such a good writer, they're also really smart. So they're funny, they're geared for that audience, they're written to be staged in the physical theater of that space. So there's going to be 3 of them. There's going to be a new one every year. So that's really fun. And then several years ago, I was approached by an animation company in Los Angeles who had this Christmas piece that they thought would make a good stage piece. So I went to a different writing partner because Peter said he couldn't do it because he was too tied up with other things. And we took this cartoon and adapted it for the stage, and it premiered in 2014, and it's now published and out there for the world to do. But it all started because I know the woman who runs the animation company. And she called me one day and said, we've got this project, and I think you might be interested. What do you think? So we got together and talked about it. And just to sort of put things in perspective, we talked about it in 2006. It opened in 2014. It was in development for 8 years. That's how long it took to get it from the idea to a production entity. And it was produced by the theater where I taught for all those years, where I was in residence for the last 5 years, and I'm no longer there. So I was there as a student, I was there as a faculty, and then I came back 5 years ago as part of the artistic director office. And I just left that position, and I'm freelancing again. So I now have time to be creative again in a way that I didn't for those 5 years of being a director, a teacher, and an administrator every day. It was like 70 some odd hours a week. And that's a lot. That doesn't leave a lot of time for writing.
What was the title of that piece?
It was called Christmas is Here Again. It was this cute little story that had come up through a family. So it was based on real events about this little girl who was born into a world who had never known Christmas because Christmas had been stolen away by some evil villain, decades ago. So it was about a world where Christmas didn't exist. And this little girl finds out about it and decides she's going to go find it and bring it back. So it's kind of a fairy tale, but really sweet.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I think we're going to open it up now for questions. I'm sure my students have lots of questions for you.
Oh, gosh. Yes.
Okay, we will start here with Amber.
What's one of your biggest challenges in the writing process of your script?
I think the hardest thing about writing is when you're writing, you have so many thoughts in your head. The hardest thing about writing is making sure that you get what the audience needs to know on the paper. I have a lot of young writers who come to me and say, will you read this? And I'll read their script and go, I don't know how you got from here to here. And they'll say, oh, it's because blah, 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 blah. I go, aha, that's in your head, but it's not on the page. So there's a great big gap in your story here because you know it, but you didn't let me know it, right? So it's being able to go between what's in your head and what's on the page. And, just always with, is it clear for the characters, but is it clear for the audience? Because if the audience can't follow your story from moment to moment and beat to beat, then they start thinking about what movie they're going to see tomorrow. And they pull out of the experience of seeing your play. So, if you think of writing as a craft, like building a house is a craft. You got to have the foundation before you can put up the 2x4s, and you got to have the 2x4s before you can nail up the siding. There's a real sense of building something when you're writing a script, and a song is just a little script. A song, I think of a song as being a 1, 2, or 3 act play that is part of the bigger fabric, and it's just making sure that everything leads to the next thing in a logical way. And that's hard. It's challenging to keep track of all of that. But it's also really exhilarating.
All right, Jaron.
I don't know, should I take that?
Hey!
Hi. So I was wondering, what did you do as a Disney Imagineer, and what do all the others do? What is that as a role?
Well, Disney, as you might imagine, is a huge complex. There was an entire suite of buildings in Burbank dedicated to this one project I was working on. They built a new park, a new theme park in Tokyo in 2001 called Tokyo Disney Seas, as opposed to Tokyo Disneyland. And it was a park that was all water-based. So you got around the park in little boats. And the unique thing about that park was it was also entertainment-based, not ride-based. There were rides, but it wasn't like Disneyland, where you've got Futureland, and you've got Kiddieland, and you've got Adventureland, and you've got Spaceland, There were amazing shows, entertainments, and I was hired to put together a tribute to the Broadway musical using no Disney characters. It was the first time they'd ever done that. So it wasn't like Mickey and Minnie take you on a tour of Broadway. It wasn't that at all. It was just a tribute to mostly Golden Age musicals, because that's what the Japanese audience loves. The Japanese audience didn't want to see Dreamgirls. They wanted to see West Side Story and Oklahoma and Evita and all of these shows from way back when. So I was responsible for writing a review that was 30 minutes long, that would have 44 people in it. It would play 5 times a day, 7 days a week for 5 years. Yeah. It was crazy. And I worked on it we worked on that project because of the whole park was being developed. So I spent 3.5 years working on a 30-minute show. And it took that long to get it right. Yeah, so a 30-minute show with a $12 million budget. It was insane. Yeah. And it was hard, but I was working with a team of theater people, not a team of theme park people. So, and Steve, this guy who hired me, that he knew that that's what he needed. He knew he needed theater people, not people who knew how to design, the Matterhorn. So we had such a great time putting this thing together, but because it was part of this huge $1 billion, I think it was a $5 billion park. And if you ever get to Tokyo, go see it. It's absolutely amazing. And that show ran for 5 years. So it closed in 2006, and there's been probably 5 other shows in that theater since then. So that was my version of being an Imagineer, was being a writer and a director. But being around the people who design one of the most amazing things I saw working for Disney was being in the park before it was finished And they had a great big volcano, like a Jules Verne volcano, kind of like the Matterhorn in Disneyland. And to see artists in there with little tiny brushes painting highlights and shadows on the rocks and the fake rocks and the fake trees. Like an artist painting a tiny little picture. They had these feather brushes painting that kind of detail onto the side of a mountain. That's the kind of detail work. That's what makes Disney Disney, is the details. So it was awesome.
That's wild. All right, Ashley.
As a director, what was the hardest thing for you to do?
I'll tell you, and it's probably not what you're going to think I'm going to say. The hardest thing about being a director is figuring out everybody in the cast and how to talk to them, because not everybody speaks the same language. You know, especially now that I work out in the world. I come together here at the Shakespeare Festival. There are actors from all over the country, all different training programs. And it's spending that first week just trying to figure out, okay, that person clearly gets me. That person doesn't quite understand my terminology. You know, because you want people to be able to be united in the show. And because they come from different schools or different backgrounds or different countries, the language of the theater can be different even with a room full of actors. And, you know, and whether it's the guy playing the lead or the fourth guy in the ensemble, my desire is always to be able to communicate clearly with each one of them if it comes down to that. And just learning the individual human ropes, to me, is harder than staging a giant musical. Because there are certain, you know, when you're staging, there are certain things that, you know, you do and the material calls for. But then when somebody goes, I don't get what you're talking about, being able to dial back and go, okay, then let me say it this way. Does that make sense? Yes. Great. We're all on the same page again. So, because you're dealing with 35 or 25, or whether if it's a 4-person play, you're dealing with 4 different individuals. And if you can crack that, then the process is going to be magic. You know, because you've sort of broken the language barrier with people.
Good point. I hadn't thought of that. Rex.
What is the hardest script you've ever written?
I've ever written?
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you. Years ago, like 20 some odd years ago, I co-wrote a musical, a Robin Hood musical, which I thought, oh, that's going to be a piece of cake. It's Robin and Marion and Friar Tuck and Little John and blah. And then we started doing the research and, you know, read the original novel. And what we discovered, and we wrote it anyway, what we discovered was Robin Hood was originally a series. There was a chapter that was printed in a newspaper or a magazine. And then a month later, the next chapter. There was no through line to Robin Hood, which is why it's called The Adventures of Robin Hood. It's like individual little, like episodes on a sitcom. This week, this happens to Lucy. This week, this happens to the Friends. This week, this happens to the Family Guy. This week, this, you know, whatever that sitcom is, and they're not necessarily connected. This week's episode doesn't necessarily connect to last week's episode. But when you're writing a play, there has to be some sort of dramatic spine. And again, it took 7 years to write that because of that. Kept looking for, okay, well, what does Robin do now? And why does Robin do that? And if you can't give him a reason to do it, there's no reason for him to do it, no matter how cool the scene or the song might be. So since then, I've been very careful about the pieces I choose to adapt so that you don't set yourself up to have to completely recreate something just to get it to make sense to an audience. So that was a huge challenge.
Savannah.
So do you get like writer's block? And if you do, like what strategy do you use to like help ideas flow?
Okay, yes, I get writer's block. And it's usually because my butt has been in the chair too long. Sitting at the computer, writing, and then you sit there and you think, I've got to do this. I've got to get this done. I've got to get this done. I find that just even getting up and going to the kitchen helps get things moving again. What I typically do is I get up and I go out of my house and I walk around the block. Because just the movement of your body gets things flowing again. And going outside and seeing the trees or seeing the street lights, or, depending on where you live, there's something about, and I was happy to discover that all of the great writers have said this. Arthur Miller used to do the same thing. He'd get blocked and he'd get up and he'd go walk. He had a woods right near where he lived. He'd go for a walk in the woods and start seeing what ideas come. But it's like anything. When you get blocked, the harder you sit there and try to get unblocked, the more blocked you get. It's just a fact, and sometimes I'll put on a piece of music. Sometimes I'll pick up a book and just open to a page and start reading. And I'll read a sentence or a word that will spark something in my brain. And then I go flying back to the computer. And sometimes that actually changes the course of where I thought the scene was going. Because I was so set in what I thought it had to be. And, it doesn't have to be anything until the audience starts coming in to see it. Then it has to be something. Does that help?
Yes.
There's something about moving your body that makes things move.
Okay. Forbes.
Do you have any traditions or anything you do before or after a play or before you start writing?
Traditions. Well, I meditate, right? I just get really quiet, and I'm one of those people who before a show is getting ready to open, if I'm acting in the show, I'm always off in a corner somewhere by myself. I'm not partying in the dressing room about how awesome it's going to be to do this show tonight. I'm one of those people who sort of needs a quiet place. And even when I sit down to write, I just take a few minutes to just take 3 deep breaths, because there's a lot going on in my life that I don't necessarily want to bring into the writing, because it's not going to help. And the same thing with acting. And before I go into rehearsal, I stop at the door and take a deep breath. I exhale. Then I walk into the door and go, hey, everybody, let's start rehearsing. You know what I mean? But any sort of, that's what I do. I don't necessarily have lemonade and cookies or whatever, everybody's got their own thing. And I just think it's whatever works for you. And I know people who just sit down at the computer and their fingers start flying. And I'm like, how do you do that? How do you do that without having, your moment to just sort of get to the computer? But everybody's wired differently. And I need quiet.
Cameron.
So I know you said you went to a conservatory, but do you think that it would be more important to go to college and keep actively learning in the learning environment, or to go just dive straight into the business and figure out what you're doing as you get there and just work hard at it?
Well, that's a great question. And it's different for everybody. For some people, school is really important, and the difference between going into a university and going into the conservatory that I went to is the conservatory I went to, I didn't get a degree. There was no degree. It's a 2-year conservatory, and all you do is theater. You don't take math, you don't take science, you don't take geometry, none of that. So if you get out of that and decide you want an actual degree, a lot of our students go on to college. I have a lot of my former students up at Utah State in Logan right now, who just graduated a couple of years ago, finishing a degree, but also training. I also have students who spent 4 years in a university, got out, went into the business, and went, holy cow, I have no idea what I'm doing. And whether that's because of them, whether that's because of the program they went through, Then they come to the conservatory for 2 years. Then they feel ready because it's like going into a laboratory. It's you do nothing but theater 12 hours a day, 6 days a week for 2 years. And you're with a group of 30 people where I teach, that you go through that entire process with them. You know, and a lot of our kids come right out of high school into the conservatory and go out and go right to work in the world. You know, but half of that equation, or probably 3/4 of that equation, is what the world is looking for. And if you're not it, it has nothing to do with your skill or your talent. You know, there's that part of the show business that's so hateful, which is you don't know what they are looking for. You know they're auditioning for Oklahoma, so you go in and do your best 32 bars that might get you cast in Oklahoma, but and the hardest thing about that is being okay with that. You know, and not putting your life in their hands and judging you based on the fact that you didn't get the job, you know. So I don't think there's a way to really prescribe what that should be. I think when you get to that point, you'll know. And the other thing about that is if you make a choice and then you're a year into it, like I did, and go, this is completely wrong for me. Having the courage to go, I'm not going to do this. Rather than thinking, well, I'm in school, I got to finish my degree, so I'm going to be here hating my life for the next 3 years. Why? When there are so many other options out there. You know, I know lots of actors who got right into show business and then had done Broadway shows and then started taking acting classes because they felt like they weren't really good enough. You know, so there is no single path. It depends on you and your relationship to the world and the kind of work you want to do. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Right.
All right. We got time for a couple more. Tristan.
So this goes back to the band stuff. You said that you played instruments in the woodwind family.
Uh-huh.
What instruments were those that you've played?
I started when I was 9 years old on the alto saxophone. I wanted to play the tenor saxophone, but it was bigger than I was. So I started with the sax and then learned how to play these other instruments. I went to college as a bassoonist. That was my major instrument. And then that's where I had that horrible teacher, and that made me get out of it. And what's interesting is music is still my primary passion. I haven't touched a musical instrument except the piano in 40 years. I literally walked away from that world into the theater and have never regretted it, you know.
I wish we had another hour we could spend.
I know, this is so great.
This has been amazing. Everyone, thank you so much. It is wonderful to catch up with you. Thank you so much for joining our class. Thank you for all the insight. That was incredible.
Thanks. My pleasure.
All right. You have a great day.
Okay. Hey, by the way, I ran into Catherine the other day.
Oh, did you?
She was coming out of Joseph, and I was stepping out of the sound booth, and I crashed right into her, so we had a little conversation. It was great.
That's great.
It was great. Yeah.
Thanks so much for keeping an eye out for her.
Absolutely. Take care.
We'll see you.
Amber, she gets to watch everything.